Good morning, everyone. My name is LaShae Brown, and this is Dynamics of Sexual Violence. Like I said, my name is LaShae Brown, and I use she and her pronouns. I am one of two of the sexual violence response coordinators at the Arizona Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence, and I've been in this position for a year now. I have experience in crisis response and in sexual assault and domestic violence advocacy, and I have personal experience being a part of a campus SART. I also want to note that this is an introductory level training, and so if you've been in the field in a while, this will be just a thorough review for you. I will also hope you will use this training again as an insight and as a starting point and continue to educate yourself long after it's finished when it comes to serving survivors. With that, let's begin. Here are our objectives. First, we are going to define sexual violence and consent. Then we're going to review the prevalence and dynamics. Then we're going to understand the root causes of sexual violence and then analyze rape myths, victim blaming, and underreporting. After that, we will move into the traumatic impacts of sexual violence and identifying the appropriate responses to survivors and healing, before lastly examining the components of evidence-based sexual violence prevention. So let's first define sexual violence and consent. Sexual violence is any type of unwanted sexual conduct that occurs without consent. And this can be both behaviors and actions, and the real important part is that it's unwanted and without someone's consent. So we have these different acts on the screen that are all different types of sexual violence. But let's dissect that umbrella a little bit more. So contact sexual violence is any type of sexual act that includes physical contact of someone's body. So this can be with another person's body part or with a foreign object. Rape is a federal legal term, so we don't tend to use it a lot at the coalition. But in most cases, it involves being penetrated. It doesn't necessarily count when a person is being made to penetrate someone else, which is why we also included that term on the slide. We usually see made to penetrate in research or in data collection because of the distinction made for rape, but we also have to remember that not everyone identifies, especially men, with terms like rape and sexual assault. Again, this can be with a body part or another object. Sex trafficking is when something is exchanged for sex without the person's consent. And we usually see it with contact sexual violence, but it doesn't have to be. If someone is exploiting someone through the internet or through an online platform, that is still sexual exploitation and sex trafficking. In general, when we're referring to contact sexual violence, we will use the term sexual assault. Non-contact sexual violence are some of the things listed on this slide. And just because that person isn't physically touched, it doesn't mean that behavior isn't harmful. So we have to talk about non-contact sexual violence as well. We have stalking, we have street harassment or sexual harassment. And just for some of you who may not be more familiar with this term, street harassment is also known as catcalling. It might be exposing your genitals to someone else or exposing a part of your body that is sexual to someone else. And it could also be things like revenge porn. So for those of you who don't know, revenge porn is when someone releases photos without your consent to someone else or on the internet, again, without your consent. And so we've already kind of touched on consent, and I've said it at least 7 times in this presentation already, but what is it? What is consent? Consent is when a person freely and willingly agrees to a sexual act without being forced or coerced. So when we look at these people on the slide, we can see that they're consenting. And we really see a lot of different agencies and different ideas that consent is about that verbal piece, but what if that person is mute or has a verbal disability, right? That doesn't mean that they can't necessarily consent. Verbal consent is one indicator, but we can also observe a person's body language, facial expressions, and tones for more context as well. Remember, A majority of our communication is nonverbal, so we should be paying attention to all the signs a person is giving. But what does freely and willingly mean? What does it look like? It is free of fear, free of coercion. It's free to express what you want. It's free to ask questions, right? It's open and transparent. It's free to choose. If you don't want it, you don't have to, and you don't feel like there's going to be a consequence for saying no. And it's free to say yes or no. And it's free to stop at any time. Consent is continuous, and it should be renewed with every new action and frequently. Consent cannot be present if fear is in the room. But what does force or coercion sound like? Come on, please, why are you being like this? It's not a big deal. Just do it. No one will know. I'll keep it between us. Are you serious? You're being stupid. We've done this a billion times before. But I love you, and if you love me, it wouldn't be a big deal. And all of these other statements, right? And if someone is saying this, they're doing so to make a person change their mind, right? If a person had their way, they would have refused or agreed, but someone is trying to do it in a way that violates their consent. And this really, what we talked about right then, without being forced or coerced, is about sexual coercion. So if you recall a couple slides back, sexual coercion was under the umbrella of sexual violence. It could be persistent sexual advances, verbal and emotional manipulation and deceit, intoxication, right? Trying to get someone less coherent or less aware of their surroundings in order to have sex or some sexual activity, or it could be physical force, threats, or harm. And I just want to note that sexual coercion is under the umbrella of sexual violence. However, it is different from the rest of the behaviors and actions such as rape, voyeurism, and so on and so forth, because it's a tool or tactic used to perpetrate sexual violence. And these are the different breakdowns of how sexual coercion is used. We have persistent sexual advances, verbal and emotional abuse and deception, intoxication, and physical threats, harm, or force. And we have to think about when it comes to sexual violence, most people think as rape as this extremely aggressive act that happens at knife point. But most times that's not the case. It usually involves manipulation, deception, or containing sexual advances without someone's consent. And just so we all have the same understanding, if you have to ask someone more than once to do something and then they change their mind, that is not consent. With that, I really want to challenge this group and those listening to this webinar to remember that just because something is an aggressive or physically threatening doesn't mean it wasn't harmful or violent. So when we look at these people and we ask them this question, are they okay with this? We can see that the answer is no, right? Some people look confused, some people are shaking their head no, some people look bored, and others look scared. And if all of those things are present, then those people cannot be consenting. Now we're going to watch a video.
There's only one way. There's only one way. They need to tell you. You need to have consent. But what does consent really mean? Consent means both parties are really, truly into what's going on. This means that nobody is being guilted or pressured into doing anything. Silence does not equal consent. Some people think it's not rape unless there's fighting, screaming, or someone yelling no. But that's not true. Communication doesn't always happen with words. Body language can say a lot if you pay attention. Are they leaning in or are they pulling away? Do they look happy or do they look uncomfortable? Are they kissing you back or are they just staying kind of still? You have to pay attention to all the signals. This includes body language and words. No one can read minds, so it's always good to talk about it. Asking for consent doesn't have to be awkward. Asking for consent can actually be kind of sexy.
Want to show me your bedroom?
Show me where you want me to touch you.
Do you want to help me take these clothes off?
So, let's break this consent thing way down. 1, everyone's clear about what's about to happen next, and they're happy about it. If you're making out with someone for the first time and you want to go further, check in first.
Can I take your shirt off?
Want to try something different?
2, everyone in the situation has to feel free to be able to say no without being pressured or hassled. It's not cool to pressure people into doing stuff they're obviously uncomfortable with, or make them feel bad for saying no or wanting to stop things. Being pushy or manipulative makes for some pretty bad sex. And obviously, if a person is drunk, high, passed out, or asleep, it's not okay to do sexual stuff with them. They can't consent when wasted or unconscious. So doing this is actually rape. 3, be honest about whether or not you're on birth control, have an STD, or having sex with other people. Wouldn't you want to know that? If you're going to get naked with someone, you have to have trust and honesty. 4, saying yes to sex once doesn't mean you're saying yes to it forever. It may be tough to pause in the middle of some super sweet action, but your partner has the right to stop at any time. And 5, sex is all about connections and pleasure, right? If everyone feels respected, sex will be much better for both of you. We all deserve a safe, pleasurable, and awesome sex life. The more respect you show to the other person, the more they'll trust you enough to relax and enjoy. And the more honest you are about what you want and don't want, the better things will go. It's easy to talk about what consent means, but what does it look like in real life? How are we supposed to know for sure how far someone wants to go or if they want to get intimate at all? Check out our other videos for tips on how to do this consent thing right.
Okay. And so I just want to note that Planned Parenthood, where this video comes from, has a lot of different and great videos about sex, about self-pleasure, about asking about consent, and different topics. And they also have videos specifically made for teens. And I know that this person in the video said that they need to tell you, but as we just went over, that's just one way. And so we have to remember that we should be looking for consent in multiple ways and the multiple ways that people communicate. Now we're going to get into the prevalence of sexual violence. So every 73 seconds, someone in the United States is sexually assaulted. And this is actually more frequent than the previous statistic that came from the Department of Justice. I believe before it was every 90 seconds. So it's happening more frequently. In Arizona, 2 in 5 women and 1 in 5 men experience contact sexual violence. And at the time, again, the survey was taken, these stats were higher than the national average. 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men have experienced contact sexual violence, and 1 in 3 men and 1 in 3 women, and 1 in 8 men have experienced non-contact sexual violence in their lifetime. 1 in 2 trans people and gender non-conforming individuals have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. And this is important to remember, especially when trans people and gender non-conforming folks experience some of the highest rates of sexual violence. 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys have experienced childhood sexual abuse. And we know that with childhood survivors, many don't disclose until adulthood. 1 in 8 lesbian women and 1 in 2 bisexual women have experienced rape or attempted rape in their lifetime, and 1 in 2 gay men and 1 in 2 bisexual, 2 in 5 gay men and 1 in 2 bisexual men have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. People with disabilities experience sexual violence 3 times more than people without disabilities, and that rate goes up to 7 times more if that person has a developmental or intellectual disability. And people with disabilities are some of the most impacted populations when it comes to sexual violence. But why is this? Well, people with disabilities are seen as less than a person, less capable, less intelligent, and it's easy to perpetrate sexual violence against someone who you view as less than you. Additionally, people with disabilities are often seen as unreliable reports and less credible witnesses. This community is also segregated much more often and isolated, and we know that sexual violence thrives in isolation. One in 2 American/Alaskan Native women and 1 in 3 American/Alaskan Native men have experienced sexual violence. And again, this is another population that experiences high rates of sexual violence. Immigrants are at increased risk to experience sexual violence as well. And there isn't a lot of hard data about this community and sexual violence, but we'll talk about some of the reasons why that might be a little later. 1 in 2 multiracial women have experienced contact sexual violence in their lifetime. Black, Indigenous, and other men of color also experience higher rates of sexual violence than white men. So again, we have to think about who we're seeing in our program and who our programs are targeting, and we have to also ask ourselves who is being missed or left out of our services as well. We also have to think about the historical and present-day stereotypes that surround Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color. Particularly for men, we know that they experience higher rates of sexual violence, but these men are also perceived to be the perpetrators or those who are causing harm when it comes to sexual violence. And when we think about all those groups mentioned, I would challenge everyone to think about how often we're seeing these communities in our programs, our agencies, or who are disclosing sexual assault. It's our responsibility as responders to reach out to these communities to work together on how we can build trust, serve these communities, and help facilitate the healing process. So a lot of the times, people think that the perpetrators of sexual violence are someone unknown to the survivor, but that is untrue. 80 to 90% of adult victims know their perpetrator. So most of the time, it's someone the survivor knows, and it may be someone the survivor loves and cares about. More than half of female victims of rape reported that at least one perpetrator was an intimate partner. For children, that rate is also high as well. So about 95% of children know the person who perpetrated sexual violence against them. 60% were acquaintances, 35% were family members, and only 5% were strangers. So this also dispels the myth that someone who is going to sexually assault you will just be a stranger who's hiding in the bushes. More than likely, it will be a person who is known to you and in your social circle. So most victims are targeted by those who want to cause harm or those who cause harm because they are perceived to be in one or more of these groups. So they are a person who is perceived to be highly accessible, highly vulnerable, and have high levels of credibility. So some people who might live or be perceived to live in the intersections of some of these categories are people with disabilities, those who are houseless neighbors or those who are homeless, older adults, children and youth, people who are intoxicated or using substances, those who are incarcerated or in detention settings, sex workers, trans folks, and other gender nonconforming folks. And the list could go on and on and on, and I am just giving a very general list off the top of my head. And we have to remember that while those who cause harm need to be held accountable for their actions, the root and cause of sexual violence is oppression. So we just said that the root cause of sexual violence is about oppression, but it's also about power. For some people, it could be about sexual desire, but at the end of the day, it really does center around power. It's about using your power over someone else or taking someone else's power away. So there's this example that I use, and there was this woman who was in Europe, I believe, and she used to hang out at this fountain. And every day while she hung out at this fountain, she noticed that she would get catcalled, and predominantly she would get catcalled by men, overwhelmingly so. So one day she decided that she was going to respond to all of their catcalls. So they would say, hey baby, come over here, I'll show you a good time, blase, blase, so on and so forth. So one day she decided that she was going to say, okay, and then walk over and proceed to take them up on their offer. What she found was that when she went over there, those men either, one, no longer wanted to engage with her, and two, some of them even apologized and said they didn't know why they were doing that. And she had a conversation with them about that. So we can see that the moment she took her power back and the moment she established that she was going to let them exert their power over hers, especially in this public space, they felt uncomfortable and no longer wanted to engage with her. I also just want to make sure that we all have the same understanding of the word oppression. So we got this definition from the Northwest Network of bi, trans, lesbian, and gay survivors of abuse. Oppression is a systematic overvaluing of some people and simultaneously undervaluing of other people based on their membership within particular groups. So those who are in dominant groups are valued and seen as better and more worthy in our society than those who are in other groups, the non-dominant groups, excuse me. And so oppression and sexual violence play out on many different ways on many different levels. First, we have the individual level. Individually, survivors internalize norms and stereotypes and blame themselves for what happened, leading to increased psychological harm. And these are just general examples. They also play out on many different examples as well. The interpersonal could be rape, miss, and victim blaming are used to discredit survivors, or it can actually be the violence. The institutional or structural level is when sexual assault is underreported, and those who cause harm are not held accountable. This is also where we see the gaps in services for survivors, especially for survivors from marginalized communities. And then lastly, we have the larger societal level. This is where we see the gender, racial, relationships, and sexual norms and stereotypes are seen as normal and fixed by society as products of sexual violence and oppression. And when we get to the bottom and live and operate at this point in society, and this type of society, we can say that if we live in a society that thinks that sexual violence is normal, we live in a rape culture. Rape culture is a culture in which sexual violence is tolerated, accepted, and minimalized. And this looks, sounds, and feels just different ways for different communities. And similar to how we are all a part of different communities and cultures, our cultures are influenced and have been changed by these ideals. And rape culture is ingrained in so many things, sometimes it's hard to recognize it on the surface. A lot of the things that we think of as normal, especially language, are coded in racism, oppression, and rape culture. So now we're going to watch another video.
involving rape and sexual harassment. As we saw in our previous episode on this topic, there's a pervasive and long-standing pattern in Hollywood of playing the sexual assault of men for laughs.
Oh, no, dear. No, dear. No.
Oh.
Just relax and we'll get along fine.
You guys, it's raping me!
I got molested by D!
What? This is about to get weird.
Let's relax for a second. Let's just stop.
These type of jokes are a staple in gross-out style comedies.
When's the last time you Purelled that thing?
On television sitcoms.
Now I'm gonna grind you like a fresh cup of coffee.
And in certain animated TV shows.
No, I'm abstinent! This is an affront to the Lord! No!
In part 1, we noted that when men are sexually assaulted, it's usually done by other men. Which is why our first video focused on male perpetrators. Now, if you haven't seen that one yet, I recommend doing so before continuing to watch this one.
Julia, you needed to see me. Oh, shit!
In this episode, we're going to take a detailed look at the less frequent, but no less troubling pattern in comedy.
You have a seat, Dale?
Do I have to?
Where men are sexually assaulted by women.
See about that.
You think rape is funny?
No, I think it's awful. Unless it's a woman raping a man. That's inherently funny.
Raph, are you just gonna sit here and let this happen?
Just like we saw with humor about male perpetrators, humor invoking female perpetrators can involve a wide range of non-consensual behaviors.
Whoa, Mama!
No.
Help me!
Quiet.
Whoa!
Nothing happened.
Oh!
You're fine, you liked it.
Neighbors!
From casual jokes about sexual harassment.
You're a shooting star, and I want to go for a ride.
God, I'm so afraid right now.
To punchlines about rape.
Last night, I sat on his nocturnal erection while he was sleeping. Okay, in some cultures, that would be considered rape.
Yeah, pretty much in every culture.
Oops.
And in many cases, the so-called joke
You did all this while I was unconscious?
Yep.
is the act of sexual assault itself.
That's my favorite.
Rape. What? Rape. That's a rape. This is what raping is. You're a raper and you raped me. That's a rape! Rape!
Oh, just relax there, Jodie Foster.
Please, I'll give you whatever you want. Please, anything you want.
Okay. And as the clip said, we really saw that sexual assault in this case was viewed as a joke. And it's something that was funny and something that was laughable. But rape culture really is everywhere, and we do see it. So this picture is of a car decal, and we can see that where that person is putting gas, whereas where this anime's character's genitals would be. And she, again, doesn't look like she's consenting. Her face looks scared. Car decals are a very easy place to find a lot of these. The next picture is of a from a book called is a costume from a book called, excuse me, I forgot what the book name was for a second, The Handmaid's Tale. And in it, the central plot of the book is really about sexual violence in a new futuristic world, and women who are routinely sexually violated have to wear red outfits. But we can see that this company thought it was appropriate to turn this into a costume. And so they're literally dressing up as someone who is sexually assaulted very regularly, right? So they're dressing up as a survivor of sexual violence, and they decided to sexualize it. The picture at the bottom left says, your daughter may try to come and stay, but we will make her come and leave, right? And this was taken in an actual fraternity. We have here a clip of a tweet, and it says, keep bashing men and you'll never have to worry about men doing anything to you. Me Too backlash, pound Me Too. And then lastly, we have this picture of a person who made this very expressive homemade costume. So I'm just gonna read the back, and it says, no more than 15 guys per girl exceeding 165 pounds, recommended dosage 4 tablets or more, not for use near video equipment, no means yes. And so what we found is that people often feel more comfortable joking about perpetration than most survivors feel coming forward. And because we all live in a rape culture, our different communities and our different sub-communities often have their own versions of rape culture. So individuals face rape cultures from the larger outside communities and within their own communities that they're a part of. So it really revolves around silence around sex and sexual violence, silence about reporting. So if it does happen, it isn't talked about and it definitely is not reported. It's kept in the family in a way to either protect the perpetrator, especially if that perpetrator is close to that family or that person and in that person's social circle, or is not to shame them back to the family. And then, like I said, there might be community support of that person who caused harm. But all of these things in rape culture survives because of things like rape myths. So rape myths are the definition on the slide, but in layman's terms, they are untrue statements that allow sexual violence to take place. And here are some of the more popular ones that we hear. So particularly men can be survivors of sexual violence. So even though it is true that men perpetrate 98% of rapes against men and women, 69% of male victims of sexual violence who had perpetrators of their rape, so this could be sexual assault, sexual abuse, sexual harassment, reported that they had female victims, and 28% of male victims of rape and sexual assault also reported female perpetrators. And so we see some other ones like trans women shouldn't be in women's only spaces because they might rape someone, when really trans women experience some of the highest rates of sexual violence. Black women don't become as traumatized as white women. This is also, again, rooted in rape culture and oppression, and it's also rooted in eugenics as well. So I just want to name for all of these that they are rooted in oppression and in white supremacy. And none of them are true. But here are some more illustrations of some of the other popular myths that we hear. So the picture on the left is of a display that was done by an organization here in Phoenix called K-Cut Darkness, and it is the What I Was Wearing exhibit. And so here people take copies or the literal clothes that they were wearing when they were sexually assaulted. So we see a hospital gown, we see children's pajamas, we see shorts, we see a t-shirt, right? And so this is what people were wearing when they were sexually assaulted. On the right, we have an example of someone else talking about rape culture and specifically talking about rape myths, right? That it really revolves around what someone was wearing. And so this woman said, if you don't want sexual/sexist comments, don't do a sexy cosplay. Okay, explain this. So in this picture in the middle, she is dressed literally as a workbench. And if you've played Minecraft and you know someone who's played Minecraft, a workbench is literally something you sit on to do woodwork, right? Or do different types of work. And these are the comments she received. Can I please craft inside you? I'd be shy putting my stick on that crafting table. Hey, you're a crafting bench, right? Let's make a baby. Glory hole cream pie, right? So even though it doesn't have anything to do with what that person was wearing, they are still blamed, and somehow society has said because of what you're wearing that you deserve to be sexually assaulted, or that's why you were sexually assaulted, which is completely untrue. But when people believe in these rape myths and somehow believe that something the survivor did caused their sexual assault, it's much easier to engage in victim blaming. Victim blaming is when a person puts responsibility on the survivor for the crime against them or for the wrongdoing, right? It sounds like you shouldn't have been out that late. Why did you let him in the house? Haven't you hooked up with him before? You shouldn't have been drinking so much. If you were really raped, you would remember it. Man up, just get over it. and all of these different other statements. And so they really ignore the fact that if the survivor was just doing what they were doing and that other person wasn't there to sexually assault them, right, then no sexual violence would have taken place. It is imperative that we as responders know how to dispel some of these rape myths and know how to stop and combat victim blaming. It is never the survivor's fault, and nothing they did caused the sexual violence to happen. So we're gonna watch another video.
Okay. Yeah. So Trey Songz used you in a song, and you tell the rest and what all had happened.
Well, you know, because you done told everybody, especially, okay? But I don't want to keep broadbeating that one situation. But I will say, Wendy, I would have loved to turn on your show and saw you be a little bit more compassionate and less accusatory and ridiculous.
I couldn't.
Why, girl?
Well,
because the gag is you wasn't there.
Well, but here's the deal. Here's the deal. We all know these days that singers, you know, to save money, all you do is throw a house party.
That's true.
And roll the camera.
Is it right?
It's not.
It's normalized, and that's my problem. That, like, forget
It's
about
not right.
I see. There we go.
You saying to me, the thing is we're then telling girls that it's okay for them to be in weird and awkward and, you know, potentially sexually harassing environments.
Right.
And they should endure it and not say nothing about it. That's why I said something about it, because it's like, look, it happens to me too.
Okay, so
it happens to all of us. Just because I'm in Hollywood doesn't mean we all as women endure that.
But at least you, unlike, you know, random girls at the party, at least they came to you and they said, Kiki, we're about to film this video.
At least.
He mentioned her in the video, and so.
No, where's my makeup and hair? Where's my styling?
But that's where I was telling you through the TV.
Honey.
But,
come on.
And you were a little turned up. You're over 21. You're able to.
I'm at the party. We're having a good time. And that's my whole thing, is that we have to start saying no when things don't feel right.
But
now,
why did you just leave?
Because I was nervous. Honestly, you guys. Think about your first time that you were in a situation where someone challenged you sexually. That is not. You don't know how to act. And it was very nerve-wracking. I mean, you know how it is. You know, you're a woman of power. How many times have you been tested in situations of how you can stand on your own and not fall at the hands of someone else?
But I was the girl who would always leave, though.
And I did leave. But I mean, if I hid in the closet for a couple seconds, what the hell?
She hid in the closet? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. We agree to disagree on that. But.
Okay. Okay, so let's dissect this clip a little bit more. So we saw Wendy Williams blame Keke Palmer at several different points, right? She said things like, why didn't you leave? You know what parties are like, but you're a woman who has power. But I was the girl who always left. And many other victim blaming statements in just under a 2-minute time frame. And some of them were subtle, but they still blamed Keke, right? Never once she said, well, he should have listened to you. I'm sorry that you were put in that situation. Even at one point when Keke asked her, but is it right? And Wendy said, no, but then she immediately went back to victim blaming Keke. I also wanted to highlight here that Keke noted sexual intimidation, which is a subcategory of sexual coercion. But victim blaming doesn't just stop with hurtful words said to the victim. So I'm going to focus on the picture on the bottom right. So this is a picture of Terry Crews, and he was also one of the prominent voices in the Me Too movement. And he talks a lot about how he was afraid to tell his story and also afraid to quote unquote fight back his the person who attacked him because of how he was perceived in his identities as a large Black man, right? And so these are some of the comments that Terry Crews got. Big as his ass is, he let someone sexually assault him. Please, he allowed him to sexually assault him to get fame. How much is enough? Sounds like he sold himself again in search for more money. I'll save my tears. No man would care about anything if another man touched him like that. He stomped him out regardless. Terry got one excuse after another. Sounds suspect to me, right? And so victims hear these things, and not only do they hear them from the outside world, from society, they hear them on the internet, they see them on TV, they see them and hear them from the people they care about, right? And those consequences are very real for survivors. So at the base, a person is not believed or they're victim blamed. From there, that person is less likely to disclose and report in the future. And that could add to the traumatization they felt because they weren't believed, they're not able to get services, so they are just having to deal with their trauma in the best way they know how, which might not be the most healthiest way. Victims from there don't receive justice within the criminal legal system, or they're believed to not be deserving of justice when they do come forward. And then from there, if no one is being held accountable and no one's getting justice within the criminal legal system, those who cause harm are not held accountable for their actions. And from there, sexual violence continues. And so does the pain, trauma, and oppression that comes with it. So victim blaming is a major reason why survivors might not come forward, but there are other reasons why sexual violence survivors do not report. Sexual assault is one of the most underreported crimes to police. 75% of those who are sexually assaulted do not report. But why is that? There are many, many different barriers, and depending on your identities, some could change or some could be taken away, right? So some survivors may not recognize that they were sexually assaulted. Some people, like I said earlier, don't identify with words like rape or sexual assault, and what these words are associated with are some big, scary, aggressive thing, and that's not everyone's experience. They may want to forget the experience. They might know that that justice within the criminal legal system is low, or some other experience that they're dealing with, and they might just want to move on with their life. They might have a fear of being blamed or not believed, and that is a really real and valid fear, as we've seen. But there might be some fear of retaliation. If they do come forward, they might be afraid of what is going to happen as a result, or what that person or that person's social group or society has told them what happened if they do come forward, because they've seen it happen to other survivors. There might be guilt about reporting someone they know. You're less likely to report against someone you know, especially if you care about them, because you don't want something bad to happen or consequences to happen to someone you care about, and that makes sense. There also might be a financial dependence on that person who harmed you, so you don't also want to have yourself hurt in another negative way but not be able to meet your financial needs. There also might be a bad experience with police. Many marginalized communities have been and continue to be impacted negatively by law enforcement. So that might be a main concern, but one of the major responses for sexual violence includes the criminal legal system and proxy law enforcement. There might also be other cultural barriers that exist, and there might just be less access to resources. So depending on where you live, the nearest sexual violence resources could be 2 to 3 hours away, and this is within the state of Arizona. So some places don't have as many access to sexual violence services, and that's a major barrier for folks, which also revolves around lack of transportation as well. There also might be concerns about confidentiality. Sexual violence and sexual assault are still topics that are surrounded in shame, so a person might not want to disclose and might not want their personal business, quote unquote, to be exposed either. There might also be a lack of inclusive services and resources. Sexual violence services and the anti-violence field, as it's been professionalized and moved and more married to the criminal legal system, has become less inclusive, right? Our mainstream services are white centering. And we need to know this and reflect on this when it comes to serving a diverse community of survivors. And there also might be a disbelief in the criminal legal process. Out of every 100 rapes, 32 get reported to the police. So we see that's a large drop off, and we know this. A lot of survivors don't report to the police. But from there, only 7 lead to an arrest, right? And as we go down this, the downward stream of justice, I believe that's what the criminology term is for it. Excuse me if I messed that up. As you can see, the biggest drop off is really between that 32 and 32 arrests and those 7 reports. And that's a very, very, very big jump. That means that less than a quarter of those reports actually lead to an arrest. But why might that be? What are some of the reasons behind that? So what we found is, and what the Department of Justice found, the Department of Justice really wanted to see why there was that downward spiral, right? Where 32 people reporting, but only 7 arrests actually happening. And this is something that they found in a report when they did of the investigating departments and departments and agencies who were investigating sexual assault. These are some of the comments that they found. They found a prosecutor talking to a detective saying, "This case is crazy. I am not excited about charging it. The victim seems like a conniving little whore." Detective, LMAO, I feel the same. In homicide, there are real victims. All of our cases are bullshit. Why are you messing up that guy's life? I just didn't believe them, the women. I know it sounds ridiculous. The way they dress, the way they act, I just didn't like them. Right? So survivors, when they do come forward, when they do feel comfortable enough to disclose their stories, they're not being believed by the criminal legal system at any point. And when they do disclose to those closest to them, these are also some of the things that were said. If you would have paid more attention to the red flags, you shouldn't have worn those clothes. You're just mentally ill. This is what happens when you're promiscuous and have a child out of wedlock, right? But it doesn't just stop there. If the survivors, even if the survivors are believed, right, they believe that the sexual assault happened, people still tell them that it's their fault. Survivors are being told and shown at every point that they aren't going to be believed and that they are to blame by the legal system, by their doctors, and by people they care about. And if survivors aren't believed, it's surprising that people even report at all. Now we're going to move into some of the more traumatic impacts of sexual assault. How do all of these things like victim blaming and rape culture impact survivors' lives? First, we have to have an understanding of what trauma is. Trauma occurs in the body when it experiences more than it can handle. And because all of our bodies function, process information, and react to stress differently, no 2 people respond to trauma in the same way. It depends on their life experiences, their culture, their beliefs, and their neurobiology, right? We all respond to stimuli differently, and sexual assault and sexual violence cause both internal and external reactions to happen to humans. So for me, if someone gave me a bag of peanuts as opposed to someone giving you a bag of peanuts, you might think this is great, it's a great snack, it's healthy, it's protein, all of that good stuff. If I were to receive that bag of peanuts, I would be very terrified because I'm highly allergic and I would go into anaphylactic shock if I ingested one, right? So even though we both experienced the same thing, we still had a very different reaction, and it could be traumatic for me, while it might not have been traumatic for you. And when we're experiencing trauma, our brain really thinks and functions differently. If you really want to know more about the neurobiology of trauma, that webinar is on our YouTube already, so please look it up. I'm just going to describe it briefly. So when we're going through trauma, the different parts of our brain that are functioning at full capacity in a normal situation do not function the same way in a crisis situation. So some of these high-level thinking things like our attention, our memory processing are offline, right? They are still processing, but the brain is doing what it needs to survive. And these things like paying attention and making decisions, this high-level thinking isn't necessary. What our brain needs to do to survive is do these very basic things. So focus on our heart rate and breathing, our movement coordination, and some of these basic senses. So this part right here. Our brain, when we're going through trauma, really is the equivalent of what a baby can do at the very beginning of their life, but these, again, basic things to keep ourselves alive and moving. And that means, when we're looking at this chart again, that memory process and memory is often impaired by trauma because that isn't something that our brain necessarily needs to survive. Our brain, when we're going through trauma, is making those decisions. So with that in mind, we need to remember as responders that survivors might need time to peel back the layers of their memory, right? They're working to put together a puzzle. And we really describe this puzzle as buying one from the thrift store. Now, I'm not sure if any of you have ever done this, but when you buy a puzzle from the thrift store, it's more than likely that you won't have the box that the puzzle came in. So you won't know what the full picture was supposed to look like anyway. Or you might have some pieces missing. So you might put together all the pieces of the puzzle and you realize that as much as you try, you still don't know what those pieces could really look like. And then lastly, there might be some pieces that are bent or they are ripped, torn, and don't go together the right way. And that's the same thing for survivors' memory as well. They might be able to remember the events that happened, but not what order they happened in. Or they might remember some very small, minute details, but they may not remember things to us who are not working and we're not existing in our trauma brains might count as a very major detail. And since we're talking about these trauma responses, when sexual assault happens, how do sexual assault survivors usually respond? People usually say things like fight or flight, right? And people usually say that think that these are the first responses people will have, and we as society judge people off of these two reactions. But in reality, most people will freeze. 75% of sexual assault victims experience moderate to high levels of paralysis during the assault. And this might help a survivor to know who's victim blaming themselves, right? To say like, I felt like I couldn't move. We can say things like, that's very normal. We hear that from a lot of survivors. When you're going through trauma, your brain's doing what it needs to survive, and your brain determined that it was the best course of action not to move. Some common impacts of sexual violence include the physical impacts that might seem unrelated to the trauma itself. So there might be some chronic pain, fatigue, or exhaustion. A survivor might experience gastrointestinal issues. There might be eating disorders or migraines or other frequent headaches. I know a survivor that after the sexual assault happened, she just said that her appetite just went away, right? She didn't feel like eating, and at first she really didn't associate that with the sexual assault. She wasn't sure what was going on, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that's what happened. A substance use or dependence, previous health conditions are exacerbated, there might be an increased level of suicidality, and the survivor might avoid healthcare, especially if the person that sexually assaulted them or perpetrated the sexual violence is a healthcare professional. And we also know that for a lot of survivors, going to a place to receive medical care, any type of medical care can feel very invasive. Many survivors also experience different psychological impacts. And a lot of these come from the re-traumatization in the nervous system being frequently dysregulated. So they might experience shame and blame, and this can be perpetuated by their environment and also larger society. They might be more irritable, numbness. They might have trouble sleeping or nightmares. They might be hypervigilant. I know a survivor also who made sure that she had to check the doors and make sure the doors were locked in every room she was in after she got home, right? That was just something that happened after the sexual violence happened, and that was one thing she could control. That's how she explained it to me. And that's what she would do. She would make sure all the doors were locked several times. There also might be more depression, anxiety, and fear, which can also lead to the PTSD and flashbacks. Also might be some low self-esteem, difficulty with sex or sexuality, hopelessness, and binary thinking. So binary thinking is when a survivor might see that there are only two options in their mind, which may lead to irrational behavior and damage to some of their relationships. So a person might say, if my house isn't spotless, it's disgusting. If someone doesn't love me, they hate me. I can put all my effort in or no effort at all. I'm either doing great or I'm doing horrible, right? It's us versus them. There also might be some impact on sexuality. We also see that this is influenced by gender roles. In our society, many of us already have an unhealthy relationship with sex. We aren't taught about it, and gender roles also impact how folks think about sex. Girls in particular and women are taught not to be sexual and hide that sexual violence happened. Boys and men are taught to be sexual and that they can experience sexual violence because of this. And for those who are not men and not women or other genders, they're not taught about sex at all, and they are seen as other and left out of the conversation. This can make it difficult for many to learn, possibly for the first time, about healthy sex. And so when it comes to having sex, many aspects of sex can be triggering. Survivors may be fearful and avoidant of sex, or they might become hypersexual, which is at the other end of the sex spectrum. It's when a person is over engaging with sex and sexuality in a way that the person perceives to be negative. Finally, there are many social impacts of sexual violence. And this is important because social support is the most important protective factor for trauma. As humans, we have a need to be truly seen and heard, especially when it comes to our trauma. Survivors may isolate or withdraw from their support systems. So friends and family may turn on that survivor, or they might not feel equipped to support that survivor, which can lead to further traumatization. Many survivors also might develop issues with concentration, leading to struggles with work or school, and also impact some of those relationships. When we experience trauma, we may feel out of sync with others and have a difficult time connecting, which can lead to survivors having a difficult time relating to others and feeling isolated, even if they're around other people. So now that we know all the traumatic impacts and the ways that survivors are impacted, how can we respond in Arizona? So following a sexual assault, a survivor in Arizona really has three options. They can disclose or report to law enforcement, disclose to a hospital, or disclose to victim services. But there's also this fourth option that I really do want to highlight and make sure that we all remember. In Arizona, if the person is over the age of 18, they do not have to report. The job of law enforcement when we're talking about the different reporting and avenues for services is to investigate. So the options associated with this response really revolve around investigation and prosecution. So in a brief overview, there are three major components that you need to know about law enforcement response. First is about the statute of limitations. So there's no statute of limitations for some types of sexual violence charges, including sexual assault, sexual conduct with a minor, if the survivor is under 15, molestation of a child, or sexual exploitation of a minor. And if you want a statute, it's at the bottom right-hand corner. Second, I just want to give a brief overview of what the initial response from law enforcement could look like. So if the report is made, the report should be taken in the jurisdiction where the crime occurred. From there, an officer should let the survivor know about their options to receive a medical forensic exam. Again, if someone is over the age of 18, they do not have to report. And I also want to note that you do not have to report to law enforcement to still get a medical forensic exam done. From there, the officer should take the initial disclosure, particularly if it's an immediate report. So if someone reports a sexual assault within the 120-hour time frame, and that report should just be asking the basic information. Because as we learned, the brain and the body are often not ready to recall information and memory right after trauma. It's actually best practice to wait two sleep cycles, before a longer in-depth interview is done. And this interview should be done and facilitated by an experienced sex crime detective or an experienced forensic interviewer. And then from there, we really move into the longer ongoing investigation. So this can take quite a bit of time, and survivors should know this, and they should be informed. And they also should be informed that majority of these cases come down to an issue of consent. So it isn't that sex did not occur. Actually, most times, each party will say, yes, sexual activity did take place. But the key part that is missing is the issue of consent. One party will say that there was consent and the other will say there is not, right? And that's what has to, that is really what is on trial. To read more about the best practices for law enforcement response, I would really highly recommend reading the Arizona Guidelines for Coordinated Community Response to Adult Sexual Assault, which can be found on the ACCD website. The other option is a medical response, right? And so that is really surrounding about, and we're talking about reporting, remember, the medical forensic exam. So the purpose of a medical forensic exam is to get medical care and treatment, to gather medical and assault history, to document those physical injuries, and collect biological and trace evidence potentially. And it also may inform the investigation or prosecution. It's really important as responders, we let survivors know that it's going to be a collection of evidence that is often very invasive, and they can start or stop the exam at any time. If they don't want to have pictures taken, which sometimes happens to document those injuries, they don't have to have pictures taken. If they don't want to have a certain area of their body swabbed, they don't have to have that happen. It's always the survivor's choice. In Arizona, the vast majorities of examiners are registered nurses, and they are specially trained and do clinical preparation. So they also receive information on the neurobiology of trauma, how to respond in a trauma-informed way, as well as how to collect potential trace evidence. They also, as sane nurses, can serve as fact witnesses or expert witnesses if the case goes to trial. It's also important that we're letting survivors know that at family advocacy centers or at hospital-based forensic nursing programs, they can get a forensic exam within 5 days of when the sexual assault occurred, right? And they can do it afterwards, but that really goes into, it really depends on where you go, if it's after that 5 days time frame. And if this isn't happening, let us know. That is something that's guaranteed for all survivors within this time frame. So it's within 120 hours, then survivors can can get a medical forensic exam. And really it's that number because after that 5 days, that person might have showered, that person might have been living their daily life, which is fine, but the evidence has probably degraded or won't be found anymore. And like I said, so the medical forensic exam process, just a couple more tidbits about this. So the adult survivors can receive a medical forensic exam without cost, regardless of whether they report it to law enforcement. So everyone is entitled to receive one if they're over the age of 18, and it's at no cost. However, let's say if there's other additional costs, so let's say that you need to you want a medical test run or you need x-rays or stuff, those unfortunately are not covered by the cost of a medical forensic exam. However, there are other ways through the criminal legal system that survivors can still get these costs covered, right? So we don't want survivors to be deterred by this fact. There's also a mandated timeline in the state of Arizona to test these kids. So in Arizona, a healthcare facility, so a hospital or a medical or family advocacy center, has 48 hours to notify law enforcement that a kit has been done. From there, law enforcement has 5 business days to come pick that kit up. From there, law enforcement has 15 business days to determine that a crime is deterred and then submit it to the crime lab. And from there, the lab must analyze the kit as soon as practical. And in Arizona, there has been a movement to prioritize these kits at crime labs. I also want to mention that this same statute mandates that law enforcement agencies must disclose to the Department of Public Safety how many sexual assault kits the agency received, the number of sexual assault kits that were submitted to the crime lab, the number of sexual assault kits that were not submitted to the crime lab, and the reasons for not submitting them for each sexual assault kit. And this information can be found on the Department of Public Safety's website. Survivors who receive advocacy. And I just also want to highlight that as responders, advocates are an instrumental part of the sexual violence services, and survivors who are able to access advocacy show significantly less re-traumatization than those who weren't able to access these services. In general, survivors report less blame, depression, and self-blame, and less guilt. They're more likely to receive services. They're more likely to seek services, and they're more likely to display fewer and less severe psychological symptoms. Survivors who receive advocacy are also more likely to receive a medical forensic exam because you have that informed decision making, and that person who knows about these systems can be tested for pregnancy and receive emergency contraceptives because as advocates we know the resources, and to receive information on HIV and receive prophylaxis because again we know the resources and we know the systems. And then in regards to the criminal legal system, survivors are more likely to report the crime to law enforcement if there's an advocate involvement, have a police report taken and have their case investigated further because there's someone who knows the system who can advocate for them, and more likely to be treated with sensitivity by law enforcement and have less distress after contact with the legal system. Again, the criminal legal system was not designed to meet the needs or support survivors. That was added much later, and we know that there are so many gaps. Advocates are not there to make other responders' jobs harder. We're not there to slow down the process, but we are there to be a consistent and knowledgeable support system to survivors who are going through this complicated and sometimes convoluted system. It is within the purview of an advocate's job to address their criminal legal partners when they believe that survivors are not being treated with empathy, respect, and diligence. But if you really want to know what are the policies and practices related to sexual assault in your area, you need to check out what they are locally, right? They vary from place to place, from county to county, and sometimes even city to city. The best way to determine what is going on in your community around sexual assault and to make sure everyone's on the same page, research has shown, is through either coordinated community response teams or sexual assault response teams. So there are active teams all over the state of Arizona, and if you would like help creating one for your community, please reach out to us as the Sexual Violence Response Department. And lastly, how should we as individuals appropriately respond to sexual assault survivors? How should I respond if someone discloses sexual assault to me? We need to know that the first response to survivors is the most important. So if you recall back to the slide with the spiral, we saw that when survivors weren't believed, the stress and the traumatization they received got bigger and it continued to spread. But if the first response is positive, then survivors are less likely to feel depression, anxiety, and PTSD. They're more likely to get help, and they're more likely to report to police. So they're more likely to be able to receive services and start their healing journey. But what are some things that I could say? I understand why you'd feel that way. I don't blame you. That's understandable. That's terrible, right? We want to make sure that we know the person we're talking to. For some people, it might be helpful for us to go into the neurobiology right away. For others, just a listening ear might be helpful. We should be tailoring our responses and our delivery for every person that we are working with. I haven't done that before, I haven't heard that before, but that doesn't make it any less true. It makes sense that you feel that way. There's no right or wrong way to deal with this. I've heard similar things from other survivors. 90% of communication is nonverbal. Make sure that we're monitoring our tone, facial expressions, and volume when talking with survivors. These are all important and greatly affect how a survivor sees you in our role. I believe you. Thank you for trusting me. I'm sorry that happened, and it's not your fault. I can't tell you what to do, but we can go over your options together, right? As advocates, we're not fixers, we're not saviors, but we can help people make informed decisions. I'm not here to judge you. Someone will be available if you need or ever want to talk, right? So make sure that we're, again, the survivor has the ultimate choice, but we are there as a support. And we, as a provider and as a responder, we also can provide certain options, right? Have you thought about talking to your friends or family? And this is really about assessing the survivor's social support, if they have them, and if they might be helpful in some instances when they're feeling triggered or looking for resources or other things as a survivor is dealing with. Have you thought about your different options? Have you thought about talking with a counselor? We can go over these options together and see which one is best for you. But we always want to make sure that we're following up with, I'll support whatever you decide to do. It's important to remember and remind survivors that whatever they want to do next is their choice and we are there to support it. And if you remember nothing else about what we're supposed to say as responders when survivors disclose, we need to make sure that we're believing. Our job is, unless we are law enforcement, is not to investigate what they're saying is true. Our job is to assist them without judgment or doubts. We are there to provide acceptance and understanding. And this judgment should be non-judgmental, and we should also make sure that we're validating survivors, so whatever they say is what we go off of, and we are there to not question, but to support and help find resources, right? And then lastly, our job is to listen, especially if we are helping and assisting survivors of sexual violence. A lot of times, advocates feel when they just listen to survivors that they haven't helped them because the assistance isn't tangible or they haven't given the survivor anything, but really, that is a service. Empathetic listening is a skill, and it's not something all people do well. Sometimes survivors just need people to listen, not to give advice or opinions. But we talked about what are good things to say, and remember they need to be adjusted for your comfortability. If you don't feel like any of those things feel natural for you to say, come up with your own phrases. But we also need to highlight what we should not be saying. We need to avoid asking why questions because they can be interpreted as accusatory and can be seen as victim blaming. We also don't want to make excuses for the perpetrator. It's not helpful for survivors and it's harmful, and we know that it's never the survivor's fault. And so another response that we can focus on is also talking about healing. And even though healing wasn't designed to be a part of the criminal legal system, it should still be one of our concerns as providers. First, we need to remember that healing is not a linear process, and we need to be reminding survivors of this. Just like no two people hurt or experience trauma in the same way, no two people heal the exact same way or in the same time frame either. Each person's healing journey is unique. Multiple things might work for different people, and it's important that we research and present multiple healing options and paths to survivors, right? It might not work right away, it might not be right for them, but at least we tried it. And specifically, it's a part of the advocate's role to assist in the healing journey. Advocates should be knowledgeable about different healing, advocates and responders should be knowledgeable about different healing modalities and options. It's also the role of an advocate specifically to provide non-judgmental, shame-free space in exploring healing, and that explores healing options to survivors and provides referrals to healing services. And so these are just some different healing options that we came up with. This is not an exhaustive list. But we also need to reiterate that survivors know what's best for them, and they can get creative with the ways that they want to heal. They know what makes them feel better, and we need to uplift that. We also need to recognize and support the ways people cope, because this would give an insight on how they heal as well. And while response is a key role in ending sexual violence, wouldn't it be even better if we stop the harm before it starts? So we have to talk about prevention as well. So these are the different risk factors for sexual violence perpetration. And again, these are not fixed factors, and they cannot predict for sure someone will perpetrate sexual violence, but when these factors are present, there is a higher chance they will. So at the individual level, if they witness family abuse, they were abused as a child, or they also had hostility towards women, if in their relationships there is a strong theme of strong patriarchal or emotionally unsupportive environment, and they live in an environment or exist in an environment where sexual aggressive and hypermasculinity is evident. In their community, if there's weak sanctions against perpetrators, so they're not held accountable, and also in their justice system, if there's lack of institutional support there to hold folks accountable. And at the societal level, if there's norms that support male superiority and sexual entitlement, right? And so these examples go back and forth, and they flow into each other and flow into each other. The individual could affect the relationship, and the societal norms affect things within the community as well. So they flow in and they flow out, and they influence each other. But these risk factors, while they show what could be negative, also highlighted some of the gaps in services and also outlined some of those strategies for prevention. So I talked about the risk factors for perpetration, but here are some of the protective, sorry, I don't know why I slipped up on that one, protective factors and prevention measures that have been backed up by data. So most of this information comes directly from the CDC technical package to prevent sexual violence called Stop SB, and that represents different strategies on the best available evidence we have that have been shown to prevent sexual violence. And I just want to note that I will just be providing a general overview of the data. So if you want to reference specific programs and materials suggested in the package, I would go to the CDC website and I've linked it to the end of the presentation. The first one is changing social norms that accept or allow indifference to violence. And these social norms include things like strict gender roles and that violence can't be prevented, right? Two of those strategies that were highlighted as a part of this method is, by this method, are bystander intervention approaches and recruiting boys and men as allies. So for the bystander intervention approach, the CDC suggests one that focuses on the individual approach that encourages people to speak up when they see something harmful and be leaders in sexual violence prevention. For mobilizing boys and men, they suggest rethinking the ideas of masculinity and gender and also supporting survivors. This approach also targets groups that often foster hypermasculinity, such as fraternities and sports teams. Teach skills to prevent sexual violence. This looks like training presentations to youth on the following topics. So the first is social emotional learning approaches such as problem solving, empathy, emotional regulation, and conflict management. Next is teaching healthy relationship skills like healthy communication, boundaries, respect, and recognizing unhealthy behavior. Then there's promoting healthy sexuality, and this includes sexual communication, consent, sexual health, and boundaries. And then lastly, it's implementing some type of empowerment-based training for women that includes assessing for violence in relationships and acquaintances. Next, we have the O, which is provide opportunities to empower and support women and girls. The first approach under this strategy is to strengthen economic opportunities for women and families to address the power imbalances between men and women. And this includes things like affordable and quality healthcare, equal pay, and equal labor force participation. The second approach under this strategy is to strengthen leadership opportunities for adolescent girls. Effective programs are programs that build confidence, knowledge, and the leadership of young girls, as well as providing opportunities for girls to connect their cultural and community identities. Now we're at the P, which is create protective environments. And these strategies are improving safety and monitoring in school, establishing and consistently applying workplace policies, and addressing community level risk through the environmental approach. Some elements of improving safety and monitoring in schools are identifying where students feel unsafe, creating safe spaces, and then addressing the problem and creating an environment of intolerance for harassment and violence. Establishing and consistently applying workplace policies might look like applying a zero tolerance policy for sexual harassment and enforcing said policy, along with having appropriate accommodations for persons being harassed. And the last approach for creative protective environments is addressing community level risk through environmental approach. So we can't fix or address the problems within community without being led and listening to community. And some of these changes are changing or enforcing already existing policies. For example, so changes in the alcohol-related policies, which have been linked to reducing sexual violence at the community level, changing the physical environment, and having an economic or social incentives for behavior, along with reimagining accountability within the community. And then we have the SB, support victims/survivors to lessen harms. And the rationale for this strategy is that the exposure to violence and other trauma in childhood can increase risk for sexual violence perpetration later in life. To lessen the harms of violence, there are different approaches that can be used in communities. And these include implementing a couple of different approaches. The first being increasing access or creating victim-centered services, such as support groups, advocacy, and improving access to community services to improve outcomes for survivors. Next is treatment for victims of sexual violence, just as affordable community-centered behavioral health services. And the last strategy is to implement treatment for children at risk and families to prevent problem behavior, including sexual offending through interventions that include reduce and risk-related perpetration among victimized youth, and increase child-parent relationship building skills. That is what STOP SV looks like in a nutshell. And that is the end of the presentation. Here is my information. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Have a nice day, and that ends the dynamics of sexual violence.